all of these suggestions or topics are things that I've pulled from others. So I'm no way like claiming them. It's just many sources from like marketing, science, communication, these other things that I've found over the last I would say 4 or 5 years. And so I kind of thought of these like 7 or 8 veins or social media. It's not the best term right now, but like things to kind of be considering when we're talking about social media. And so it's not exhaustive, but it's at least a good starting point. So the first one is, the coolest thing about the internet is it just literally fundamentally changed the way in which we can go direct to consumer. And we've all experienced this in different ways, whether it's uploading a Facebook post and going to people, or through business sort of means, or like in this transactional nature of where, you're part of a licensing committee, and you're trying to communicate with your different stakeholders that are out there. And so it's really cool because in a way it democratized us being able to reach people faster, but it's not totally that. It doesn't reach everyone always. And it's kind of this rigged game where these algorithms are, nobody knows what they are, but they're potentially, running the platform, encouraging certain types of behavior, etc. And so when you were talking about, how do we start to look at these more effective communication strategies or alternative communication strategies, I would say this is more now part of kind of the game of communicating in today's day and age. It doesn't need to replace anything. So it doesn't replace any sort of memos, mandates, any sort of formal communication strategies that you put out there and things like that, especially from governing bodies or entities that are kind of directing, like, here's how we go forward in these sort of things. As an example, like Facebook pages, someone like ABI that has their Facebook page of whatever it is, 25, 30,000 people to follow, organically, which means you just upload without paying Facebook to push it to more people, is only going to reach an estimated like 5 to 7% of your followers. And that's just, unfortunately, because of the economics and the ways that these platforms are set up. So I just wanted to say, like, it's a really cool potential tool, and I think it's necessary, but it's not the end all be all, and not even one of them isn't. And so that's point one. Point two would be, you have to think about how you will communicate what you want to communicate out there, and do it in some sort of like interesting way. This seems to be a theme on, regardless of your genre, your industry that you're in, that it's when you can kind of creatively, right, pull different things into a unique way that might be being done somewhere totally else, like you just picked up somewhere else, but putting them in a way in which the audience that you're trying to reach is like, oh, that's different, that's fresh, right? So one thing going on with a lot of the pandemic and Zoom meetings that we talk about is like Zoom burnout is a loose term that I hear people say, where it's just like, I'm here all the time. So like, there's a huge stark increase right now. Actually, I think it's about 250% increase on the number of streaming services, or the amount of streaming that's increased globally is up 250% because of the pandemic. But if you have the same thing or you're in the same format, like, that's where it doesn't necessarily work. So it's, how can you communicate what you want, do it in an interesting, creative way? And it's really just a game of stimulus control on this grand scale. You're talking groups, culturally, at this cultural level of analysis, right? Like, how do you create things that'll reach people, and it's a stimulus control game. And so there's some practical tips that I'm getting to later, but that's really the way that I look at this. Now, people say in marketing that you should be focusing on like one person. What's your ideal person, right? So you say, I'm trying to reach, BCBAs, folks with their board certified behavior analyst credential in the United States, perhaps. Something like that is what marketing will tell you to like kind of go down. Like, can you identify the features and who you're trying to create for? What are their tendencies and things like that? But it doesn't necessarily jive with our field. There's history, context, culture, current environment, right? And it helps to think this way, but it's like antithetical to behavior analysis to try to group people into one category, right? When we think about those sort of things. So you'll find a lot of marketing things that say, try to create for one ideal person in mind, and who you're trying to reach. I think you can kind of do that, but you just can't let that get in the way of inclusivity and like reaching your target audience necessarily. So a lot of marketing stuff you'll find, and people critique saying like, who are you trying to reach? Who are you trying to reach? I think it's good to think about that, but it'll only take you so far. And the kind of core thing in this number two is, who are you trying to reach, and is it in a way that like captures their attention and maintains that stimulus control over time for them to consume entirely what it is, whether it's video, audio, written, whatever. Number 3 would be there's the social context in each platform. So I think of them as like rooms. So LinkedIn is a different room or social context than Facebook, than Instagram, than Twitter, than etc. And this, you can see the difference between, a formal ABI licensure meeting, I would assume, is different than something in which you're sitting amongst, planning meetings with board of directors there for something else, like depending on who's in the room, right? Like that social context and the history changes. And this 100% is important and like changes how well your communication strategies work at the end of the day on these platforms. So what I mean by that is, for example, like Twitter has some basic limitations of 280 characters. Now you can create threads, but like it's kind of meant for this short discourse kind of back and forth. You hop over to Instagram. These are places where you have visual imagery, typically is your number one. It's pretty much what people are there for. There's some commenting and like discussion tools that you can kind of engage in there a little bit, but they're just inherently different. LinkedIn is usually one that's pretty easy to see the difference of. You got people dressed up and usually, their headshots, professional attire, things like that. And it would be a completely different person sometimes if you looked at their LinkedIn versus their Facebook, LinkedIn versus their Instagram. And so when I think about communicating a singular message to some sort of target audience, I also think of, okay, what's my main message, but how do I kind of tweak it for these different platforms? Maybe I have an image included in one part of it, maybe I don't in another, maybe it's a little bit longer of a description elsewhere. And it's more so how do I tailor it to that social context of that room. I've tried to slowly experiment with these sort of things over time. And so I don't bite them off all in one, but I'll start with, how do we build a system to where we create this sort of content we're trying to put out there, upload it across these different social platforms and see what happens. Get some feedback, see where it performed well, maybe where it didn't. If there was anything that I could do a little bit better and differently, like I take this in an iterative process and those sort of things add up over time. There's a lot of ways to incorporate data and there's a lot of data out there. So when I say data and social media, I do think about like if you can potentially get some perspectives and some feedback prior to posting something up there, it's really useful and beneficial, and that's a really good feedback loop, and that's very, very valuable data to have before you put things out there, especially on sensitive issues and topics like that, right? We already have those internal review processes usually set up in organizations for communication and whatnot, right? Same thing applies there. On the back end of social platforms though, it'll tell you generally, each of them will tell you about how many people you're reaching, which think about these as, they call them an impression typically. How many screens are you showing up on? Not necessarily that they liked, engaged with it, shared it, watched it in its entirety, but it was presented to them. There was a potential there for some stimulus control to occur. Now that might be that they were just scrolling past really quickly and they actually didn't even consume or like engage with it. Or it could be an impression can lead to like actual engagement with it. And usually people talk about engagement as either like, share, or commenting. Those are typically your ones there. So when you start to look at them, you can start to understand like a bit of your consumption behavior. So if you have a lot of impressions, but not a lot of comments, right? That could be something to where like maybe it's a sensitive topic, or maybe it's one of those things where you did it justice and like people are largely in agreement, right? It could be one of those things where like there's, I guess what I'm getting is like you've got to kind of sort through that, and those are things you can sort through as you're posting more and more stuff out there. But the basics are your impressions versus your engagement. And so some things like a video, for example, will give you kind of your engagement time or length. So on YouTube, what's really cool is they will give you, I can show you all this, some examples in the back end, but they'll give you unbelievable amounts of data as to not exactly who's watching, but what age range your consumers are from, how many percentage-wise are from different areas, states, if you want to break them down into different geographical regions internationally. You can look at the time that they're typically consuming. Like you can do all this. It's always in a group format in these sort of ways. So that's the thing you got to kind of always remember here. We're so into individual, one-on-one, sort of single subject sort of stuff, that this is just different there. So you're taking some insights, I would say, from this data. There's things that you can look at, though. Largely what I try to look at is things like your share rate, your comment rate. For me, comments that come in, whether publicly or privately behind closed doors, of people saying like, this was really great or this was a little off, like those are things I really pay attention to there. Those are important feedback streams for me. And then share rates, like is kind of in this way, like I look at it as, people think that I'm on point with what I'm trying to create and share out there. And so I look at those share rates. I don't live or die by these sort of things. If I think something's important, we'll put it out there. But those are, I guess, some of the data streams that I look at. Feedback beforehand, if I can, take that into consideration. Feedback in the moment on the comments or behind the scenes sort of direct messages and what those folks are saying. And then how is it performing? And sometimes in video, like I like to engage with, it'll tell you how much the video people are consuming. But there is a ton of data you can look at. And I can give some examples in a minute once I finish these points, so you all can kind of see based on which platforms you want to start with. Now, the next point would be people are expecting good content, more and more, I would say. And so as quality of what we're used to consuming on Netflix, whatever it is, right? Like I think there's this kind of slowly rising, like higher and higher quality is kind of what we're slowly getting used to and almost expecting. I don't have data on this. I could be off on this. But there's always this question between content versus quality. And it will still always hold that great content will forever work. This is why viral cat videos, this is why TikTok is huge right now with youngsters, is it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be a really great story, really funny thing, really great piece of valuable something that people are looking for. But that quality is like a very close second. So this is where in video, for example, I've started to pay more and more attention to, and I made the big error up front of like just not paying attention to my audio quality. For me, it was good enough, but it wasn't good enough for everybody else. And so I try to think about, if a picture is pixelated and I'm gonna post it on Instagram. Unfortunately, Instagram's known for like these clean, crisp, beautiful images usually. So it's not the best thing I could be doing. Like if there's a way to get a little bit of a better image, I would try to do that in that circumstance. And again, these are iterative things that I kind of take over time. That's something to constantly kind of thinking about. And then there's kind of two types of content you can make, which is like a sub bullet under here, which is your evergreen content. These are things that are always going to be valuable. They're always going to be useful. They're not contextually relevant, I guess, on a certain time period or current climate or what's going on. Then you have your currently relevant stuff. For example, I did a couple webinars on the pandemic and ethics around it, and those webinars did exceedingly well compared to typical videos because that's what people needed in the moment around March when they're trying to sort out, as practitioners and business owners, what do we do ethically to navigate this pandemic? Now, that stuff completely fell off after those 3 weeks because it no longer becomes relevant. There's other stuff that's out there. There's a totally changed landscape, right? And so there's kind of this strategy to where you try to find a balance there. Like, what are things that you think would be useful to put out there that maybe you're answering all the time on emails, or you're getting the same questions over and again, because those are things you can potentially turn into evergreen content. But current relevant stuff is actually almost will get you more views up front and better in the moment, but dies off. So it's kind of one and the other, right? So I try to think about, if I'm making a video on things that are related to the pandemic, that's gonna be something that's currently relevant. But in hindsight, like if I can make things that are more basic principles of behavior, things on reinforcement, punishment, extinction, things like that, those are gonna live forever potentially if I do them correctly and they're out there. Now, a couple other things to kind of wrap up. Next point would be this quality versus quantity starts to kind of shape up then. And if you can find your stride in like making things that people are enjoying, you get your creative process down as a team and how you're kind of creating, posting it, making sure that it was, vetted beforehand before it went up and etc. Then there really isn't too much if you're finding your stride, really. But you're just at risk of this stimulus control thing. So what I mean by that is, if you find this spot where you're making really great content, you can really never do enough, and you can just keep putting it out there. You're gonna you're gonna hopefully be achieving the goals and things that you've set out there beforehand. But what you do is you risk like potentially messing up on a post and getting yourself in some hot waters, or you potentially risk putting out a dud that kind of throws everybody off there too, right? And so I don't stress the quality over quantity stuff too much. It's more so, can you build up kind of these interdependent group behaviors of like getting your stuff out there somewhat consistently is kind of the first goal. And if you start to find strides and things that are working, then yeah, more is better. But also, these things are like slot machines. I mean, like these algorithms, like you can't feed them enough to necessarily feel like you've achieved your goal. Like there's no end. There's no end in sight in these sort of things. So it's also like, don't kill yourself over trying to create as much as you possibly can. And then the last one would be, there's quite a lot that goes into storytelling and structure of how you're creating your stuff. So I like to give this example of the ABC analysis that we have, or any sort of ABC 3-term contingency in our field. Is there's actually one that's really similar in the storytelling field that's called the ABT method. And it's and, but, therefore. You frame your information in, there's this thing kind of going on and there's this sort of context, but there's this unexpected thing that you didn't know about, and therefore this is what we've provided you and this is kind of your solution. And it's one of those things that you can easily fit into something that's like, say, like an ABI licensing committee issue, where it's like, hey, we put out this statement, there's some things that have come out since then, and they have these sort of implications. But what we've done is we've created this super useful thing for you. Therefore, go to this link, check it out, and here's your resource. So this ABT method is something that science communicators, which stands for anybody in science trying to communicate their science out there. It's regardless and agnostic of your field and your industry that you're in. It's just a bunch of people trying to figure out how to use that ABT method as kind of like your basic strategy to be able to entice people to listen to what your science has to say, hopefully retain the beauty of your science and like not water it down, but effectively communicate things across there. And just like an ABC analysis, like we know a 3-term contingency can be broken into a 4-term. You can look at a Cantorian, a Skinnerian approach. You can look at whatever it is, Gold Diamond's model. Like there's a lot of different ways to look at these things and break these things down. I would say that ABT is just the beginning of it. But I've found more and more and more, if you can figure out how to tie in the storytelling aspect, since it'll help perform better. And this is this weird balance, because in a science we're so clear, objective, factual, like here's what's going on, that it feels a little weird for us. So I guess I encourage behavior analysts and people that are out there creating to try to play around with this storytelling stuff a little bit. Examples are a simple way that you can start to do this. Usually they have a basic storytelling structure in there. And it's not because the objective sort of stuff isn't valuable necessarily, but it seems to be a way to get people interested in, make something that's a little bit more relatable to, and like entice them into listening more and coming back more and more. All right, hope you all enjoyed. I'll catch you in the next one. Please like, share, subscribe if you found it interesting. If there's better resources or tools, strategies, tips, things that you have, I would love to know about them in the comments. I will see you in the next one. That's your Daily BA.